All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to Iran 1400's Spotlighting an Author event. Today, we will be discussing Abbas Amanat's forthcoming book, Persian Historiography and Iranian Identity, or in Persian, Tarikh Negari va Hoviyat Irani. First, I'd like to take a minute to explain the project for those of you who might not be familiar with it. The goal of the Iran 1400 project is to encourage healthy and productive conversations about Iran, rather than shouting and posturing. The project believes that there is a need to foster deeper thought about where Iran has been and where it's going, and in particular, what Iranians want for the country. In developing that thought, the Iran 1400 project hopes to make a constructive contribution to better understanding Iran. We are incredibly honored to have Dr. Abbas Amanat with us today. We have a quick teaser to introduce our distinguished guest. Now we have a few remarks from the project's communication manager, Tabi Anvari.
Dr. Amanat, on behalf of the advisory board and the team at Iran 1400 Project, we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. The Iran 1400 Project's mission is to foster a greater understanding of Iran's history during the past century in order to promote an informed conversation about Iran's future. We are honored to have you with us today to share your research and insights on the Iranian experience. Welcome.
Thank you very much for this generous introduction. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share my recent research on a topic that probably is not the mainstream of Iran 1400 project, but historical insights are always good. And I was heartened to know that prior to my presentation, Willem Floor and probably others, colleagues, have also shared their historical research, his historical works. As it was announced by Sydney, the topic of my talk today is calendar. It's slightly different from what I earlier on provided Iran 1400. It's slightly different. It's called Calendar, Memory, and Reconstruction of Iranian Modern Identity. It's a little bit more focused. However, you would hear a great deal of pre-modern, that is from ancient to medieval, in this talk. It's one of those talks about calendar that you have difficulty focusing only on modern. You have to say a great deal about pre-modern too. And I hope you bear with me and find it of interest. Well, of course, I decided to propose this particular topic for Iran 1400 because it's a rather nice coincidence given the dark and trying times that we are living in these days and the terrible news that we hear from Ukraine and the presence of Russian threat that has for this year, for 300 years, was a major concern for any Iranian government. it is at the same time is a kind of a coincidence with the coming of the Nowruz in 10 days' time, and gives us some, I hope, an insight into how significant Nowruz is beside its social function in terms of the Iranian aspects of Iranian identity. Since most of the time, discussions about calendar, which is very old and very interesting, and discussions about Nowruz as well, does not necessarily correspond to this historical identity that I'm talking about. Of course, the concept of identity is very vague, and it can be interpreted in many ways. But here, more specifically, is a sense of awareness that we would witness in modern Iran, probably from the time of the Constitutional Revolution at the turn of the 20th century, of this long history that the Nowruz festival and the solar calendar, the Khorshidi calendar, had played in the Iranian awareness of themselves as a community, as a country, as a society, as well as in their collective memory. That's why the term memory is actually included, and more of it is going to be said about it in a moment. As it was also pointed out, this is part of a volume that I'm producing in Persian called Tarikh Negari and Bazsazi Hoviyat Irani, that looks at various aspects of how historiography plays a part in the shaping of identity and this collective memory. But today, of course, I limit myself only to talk about the development in the solar Iranian calendar and this most famous, most well-known of its markers, that is the Festival of Nowruz. As some of you might know, beyond the functionality of any calendar, including the Iranian calendar, of keeping time, calendars are important because they are keepers of a kind of a collective temporal memory for any kind of community. And as such, if we are now standing at the very end of the year 1400 of the Iranian Hijri calendar, solar Hijri calendar, it's interesting to find out how this comes about, how we become in the course of time, how this evolved, and eventually how it actually was established as the official calendar of Iran. Well, in order to make it perhaps a little bit more accessible, perhaps it would be worthwhile if I just go on with the rest of my talk, showing you some slides rather than just a talking head. And that hopefully would be able to provide some more kind of visual images of what I'm talking about. So just give me a moment to switch. Here we are. All right, I hope that you can see the screen with the title, and I move on to the first of the slides here. I must confess that I'm not a historian of science, and certainly some of the technical aspects is quite challenging, but I try to make a good use of some of the images in order to start my talk by setting actually the geographical, ecological aspect of why the solar calendar is particularly significant in the Iranian case. As some of you might know, the Iranian solar calendar is one of the oldest, if not the oldest in the world, and one of the most accurate, as a matter of fact. And the origins of that goes back really to the Achaemenid times. I rather hesitate to start again with the Achaemenid, as it's often the case with many of the nationalist Iranian interpreters, but it's inevitable really to talk about that, and I don't apologize for it, as a matter of fact. What we can see here on the top left is the temperate zone of the Northern Hemisphere, shown in the light blue. As you can see, Iran is located here in that zone. The temperate zone, as I'm sure some of you might know, is a kind of a part of the globe whereby the 4 seasons are more regulated. That is, that you have indeed the spring equinox, that is vernal equinox, the beginning of the spring that it's approaching at the beginning, and the Nowruz festival, and the autumnal equinox at the beginning of the fall. And this is important to remember because in effect, these regulated seasons, the 4 seasons, determines the significance of it for the purpose of agriculture. If you look at the top right, you'll see that it fairly nicely corresponds to the global cropland distribution, namely that it says what part of the world this band of the northern and southern, actually, temperate zone is the one that is where the agriculture is actually determined by 4 seasons. And as
Dr. Amanat, if I could interrupt you real quick, if you click the slideshow button.
Oh, I'm so sorry. You should have. Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
I didn't want to interrupt.
No. Thank you so much. Yes, this is terrible. I'd forgotten to do that.
Oh, no. It's all right. We can see it fine. It'll just help us see it a bit clearer.
But in order to do that, I have to get rid of this band here in front of me in order to be able to reach there. So that's the problem.
It won't let you just click the slideshow button at the top?
No, because there is a band in front of it shows that. Let me see, how can I do that? Perhaps I should go back here. Click here to, no. Okay. Let me stop. Go back again to screen share. No, let me stop again because this is what it shows here. It's the same issue. There we are. Let me see. Now
Perfect.
You should be able to.
That's it.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. So going back, thank you very much for that. Going back, you can see at the bottom, it also shows the percentage of total land area covered by agricultural land in 2008. And as you can see, Iran here, again in the temperate zone, only has 15 to 20% of its total land cover, area cover, to agriculture. That further determines the significance of the timing for agricultural cycle, for planting, for seeding, and for the harvest. That's why it is important to have a solar calendar that would determine particularly the time of the year when these agricultural activities has to take place. And if you look further into a map of the length of growing period in Iran, you would notice that much of the country, as you can see from the graph on the right, that much of the country is probably about 20-25% of the country only grows, has an ability to grow within 2 to 4 months, or 5 months, perhaps the little bit more on the northwest. But that means that, again, the accuracy of the time of planting and the time of harvest should be determined normally by the taxation or fiscal policy of the state. So the state from the very start plays an important part in the way that timekeeping is regulated. And the regulated timekeeping very much depends on the cycle of the seasons, as it's evident here. If you look at the two images that I've produced, the one on the right is the Thalamic geocentric conception of the equinox. I'm sorry that I have to use some kind of astronomical terms here, but this is important to notice. This is the diagram in which this Earth was considered as the center of the world, the old ancient Thalamic diagram, whereby you can see that the movement of the sun around the Earth comes to the points of balance between the day and the night, and the temperature standing at, particularly in the temperate zone, as the suitable time for the plantation and for the harvest. This is the vernal equinox, the beginning of the spring. This is the autumnal equinox, the beginning of the fall. And of course, the summer and the winter solstice. What it shows you here on the left in the heliocentric, modern Copernican notion of equinox is not much different. So in a sense, the calendar doesn't make the solar calendar, whether you believe in the ancient model of the geocentric diagram or you believe in the heliocentric conception of the equinox. It's exactly the same. This is the vernal equinox, when the Earth is located and positioned in a way in March 21st, 22nd, when it's the best time of the year for the start of the plantation, and when indeed the marker of Nowruz becomes so significant. Now, as I pointed out, because the state is a major regulator in the process of timekeeping, you can see that several of the important activities of the state is tied up to the concept of the calendar. The first one is the fiscal arrangements, the way that the state would organize its own finances and its own taxation. Many of these calendars are actually closely tied to the idea of taxation. And taxation is a major function, for better or for the worse, of the state. And therefore, in any kind of an agricultural society, Iran included, it is important for the state to play a part in it. If you move on to the next slide here, not only the taxation and the fiscal calendar is important, but the Iranian model of governance from the ancient time has always been a guarded domains. That is what is today, or rather in the course of early modern times, referred to as Mamalik Mahruzeh Iran, that Iran was considered as a series of smaller subordinate states to an imperial power in the center. That's called the guarded domain, Mamalik Mahruzeh. And as such, the beginning of the year or the solar calendar has always been also tied up to the idea of reassertion of the state authority. Many of the appointments were made at the beginning of the year during the Nowruz festival. Foreign relations has been renewed, and representatives come to the presence of the authority, the king, and the gift exchange, a very important function of how the subjects or foreign representatives has to show their loyalty renew their, in a sense, their contract, their social contract with the state through the process of giving gifts and receiving gifts. Also important for this significance for why the solar calendar is persisted for so long is that royal accession at the beginning is at the beginning of the calendar. So basically up to, one might say, early modern times, and perhaps in certain respect up to modern times, the accession of the ruler was considered as the beginning of the era in which the calendar was calculated. So the ahd, the term that was used in the Islamic times is for era, as ahd Shah Abbas or ahd Malik Shah Seljuqi or so forth, is a representative of the fact that how the calendar with the accession of the new ruler would start anew. And then, of course, another feature of the significance of the solar calendar is that Iran, like many of the ancient nations of the past, had a kind of a multi-calendaric personality. That is that there were more than one calendar. In the Iranian case, there is a Hijri calendar, just a lunar calendar that comes with Islam, versus solar calendar that was used, as I pointed out, for taxation, referred to as the Kharaji calendar. And with it comes the idea of the keeping of the fiscal records in early Islamic era, which was initially in Persian, in Pahlavi, Middle Persian, and then eventually was switched into the Arabic. And that also played a part in the establishment of the Hijri calendar as the beginning of the lunar calendar that it's observed by the Iranians, particularly for religious purposes. So it's, I pointed this out in order to mention the fact that one should bear in mind that this kind of a multi-calendaric notion has a very old origins in Iran, even in pre-Islamic times. Now, as familiar images from the Persepolis may give us some idea of how this in an ancient times was observed. On the left is a very famous scene of a zodiacal sign representing the vernal equinox, presumably. That's how it has been interpreted by many specialists of archaeologists and specialists of the ancient times, where we can see lion, which symbolizes the earth, attacks the bull, which attacked by the bull, when the lion, which is symbolizing the sun, attacks the bull, which symbolizes the earth. I'm sorry, there's a mistake here. This is a relief in Apadana. There's a famous part whereby on the right you can see also the image of Darius receiving gifts from various nations during the celebration of Nowruz. That again is important because of certain features. Much of the gifts that was brought to the King of Kings are basically agricultural products, which corresponds to the fact of the significance of the maintaining the timekeeping. Also, it's important because it shows various ethnicities that were part of this idea of various nations subordinated by the King of Kings. If I go back to the image of the bull and the lion, this presumably was a zodiacal sign, although it does not correspond to the shift of the time from the end of the year to the new year, from Hut to Hamal, in the old calendar. But that's because probably the zodiacal sign over the long course of time is changing. And this indeed reflects the Nowruz. This indeed reflects the change of the month in the ancient calendar. If you move on further in the Iranian legend, where we see in the Shahnameh, the first mentions of the Nowruz were made, or one of the first mentions of the Nowruz, around the year 1000, when the Shahnameh was composed. And of course, the legend is much older, but this is how it has been re-edited, in a sense, in the story, in stories of the Shahnameh, particularly in the story of Jamshid on the left, which being portrayed here on the flying throne, carried by the enslaved Deves, who, as a matter of fact, taught him many of the aspects of civilization, including writing, architecture, and so forth. These are presumably the indigenous population of Iran that came to be dominated by the newcomers, in this case, the Aryans, of which the story of Jamshid corresponds to, and on the occasion of Nowruz. So that's one indication that it's a kind of a highlight of the process of urbanization of Iran during the reign of Jamshid. And then on the right, you can see the master musician Barbad in a scene of Nowruz in the Sasanian era, according to the Shahnameh, performing atop of a tree according to the story, for the Sasanian ruler Khosrow II, Khosrow Aparviz. And this is from the famous Shahnameh of Shah Tahmasp. This is one leaf of that Shahnameh, which again, as you can see, describes the festivity of the Nowruz and how it was associated with music and with kind of activities that even today we associate with Nowruz, providing all kinds of sweets and so forth that is part of the Nowruz festival. And zooming all the way up to the 19th century, you can see the persistence of the idea of state celebrating the Nowruz, in this case, in the famous Negaristan Palace murals, the whole cycle, as you can see, done by Abdullah Naqashbashi Kashani in showing Nowruz in 1812, of course, with some historical inaccuracy, but nevertheless, very realistic representation of how the Saf Salam, the royal levy, was ordered, as you can see on the top left, Fath Ali Shah on the famous throne, Takht Tawus, with senior princes, including Abbas Mirza and several others. The second, bottom left, shows the officers of the court, and the third and the fourth shows dignitaries and foreign representatives that were portrayed in the Negaristan mural cycle. This is a copy, perhaps the most accurate copy that recently has come to light in the Windsor Palace Museum in London or in the UK, done in the 1830s by the British representative, by the order of the British representative. And as you can see, it beautifully portrays the actual cycle, and also gives all the names of the individuals who are present in this magnificent scene, including on the bottom right, as you can see here, the three British representatives, Sir John Malcolm, Sir Gore Ouseley, and Sir Hartford Jones, and the three French representatives in the court. Of course, there is, as I said, there is some chronological inaccuracy because actually the French left immediately before the coming of the British. Gardin Mission, basically with Gardin, Joubert, and another representative of the French. Naqashbashi himself was portrayed here second on the left from the top panel. As I put this one here in order to show that still in the early 19th century, this is just before the Iranian defeat in the war of Russo-Persian War, the first round of the Russo-Persian War, the celebration of the Nowruz was observed with great pomp and circumstance through the Qajar period, certainly in the early Qajar period, and as a kind of a reassertion of the authority of the King of Kings, as Fath Ali Shah called himself, based on the ancient model that was seen in many of the reliefs around Iran, and the same model was actually copied and adopted for the celebration of the Nowruz. Now, if we move on further, in the Islamic era, we can see in the early Islamic era, there is a tremendous veneration for the Sasanian past. And therefore, this memory of the calendar was preserved through many of the accounts produced both by Arabic historians, scholars of Iranian origin, and by the others. And certainly by the group of early Iranian nationalists called Shu'ubiyya, who were really should be translated as the Persophiles or their Persophilia. There's a love for Iran that you see in many of their writings in all aspects of Iran, particularly veneration of the Sasanian era, that created a great deal of controversy between the pro-Arab and the pro-Iranian factions within the early Islamic society. There are numerous examples of that. We would examine one of them. And then around the year 1000, probably, the beginning of the 11th century, we see a kind of a Persian revival of this memory of the past, of the memory of the Sasanian era, of which there's numerous examples, as I'm going to show you in the works of Abu Rayhan Biruni, in the creation of the Jalali solar calendar, in establishment of Isfahan as the Nasf Jahan, or the prime meridian, and in the kind of a confrontation or contestation from the religious establishment against this memory of the Nowruz. First, if you look at Abu Rayhan Biruni, and probably one of the greatest scholars and scientists of pre-modern times worldwide, not only in the Islamic world, who produced most of his works in Arabic, but some of his works in Persian, of which the Arabic work, one of the most famous, that indeed made him famous in the West, is Asar al-Baghiya min Qurun al-Khaliya, that's often been translated as the chronology of ancient nations, but as a matter of fact, probably is the legacy or the enduring legacy of the past centuries, that it's a very clear sense of awareness of the importance of the legacy of the ancient past, particularly on the side of the Iranians. Biruni was from Central Asia, from somewhere outside, I believe, Samarkand, or maybe Bukhara, I'd forgotten, and produced works mostly, as I said, in Arabic. And as you can see in the manuscript, that it's a early 14th century manuscript, Timurid period, is in the University of Edinburgh library, where you can see that these are the folios that describes the Nowruz and the Vernal Equinox. The one on the middle is the actual presentation of the equinox and the significance, the astronomical significance of the equinox. If you look at the right, you would see that the work of Biruni was particularly significant in the 19th century for recognition of the Iranian, or rather Islamic Iranian, contribution to scholarship of medieval times. This is the early translation by Edward Zacho, who did several translations of the works of Abu Rayhan Biruni, and this one published in 1879 in London. And what's significant about it, that it was picked up and commented upon later on by some Iranians who particularly was interested in the calendaric issues, of which probably the most significant is Hassan Taqizadeh, a major figure during the Constitutional Revolution, and himself one of the people responsible for the adoption of the solar calendar in modern times, that produced a series of articles in London around 1935-37, whereby he talks and comments on the calendaric aspects of Asar al-Baghiyah. And then there was a Persian translation earlier on, perhaps around 1860s, I would say, by the famous Iranian first minister of culture, Ali Gholi Etezad al-Saltaneh, the founder of the Darul Funun, the first, in a sense, the first principal of Darul Funun, who translated Asar al-Baghiyah into Persian, which shows something about the way that the Iranians again tend to reconstruct and rediscover this tradition of celebrating the Nowruz and the significance of the equinox as early as 1860s, or perhaps even earlier. Then later on, it was commented again around 1840s by a former colleague of mine, a senior colleague of mine, Franz Rosenthal at Yale, and who published in New Haven in 43 a study of Asar al-Baghiyah. This all shows that how, in a sense, there was a continuity in understanding and rediscovery of this ancient tradition of the Nowruz, first by Biruni himself in the 11th century, and then later on by the commentators in the modern times. Another work of equal importance is the Arabic text that was produced indeed by one of the Shawbiya, Hamza ibn al-Hasan al-Isfahani, called Sani al-Muluk al-Arzab al-Anbiya, that is maybe translated as the years or the chronology of the kings of the earth and the prophets, in a model that was a genre in the early Islamic period, in which is a fascinating text. It has been translated into Persian recently by Ja'far al-Shu'ar in the 1970s, whereby you can see on the right, the original Arabic on the left, the translation on the right. I chose for you the page here on chapter 6, which gives its equivalent of the occurrence of the Nowruz to the Hijri calendar. So it says the first year of the Hijra, Nowruz occurs in such and such a date. And it gives all the way, this is the first year, as you can see in the Persian translation, Sale Yek. And then here it gives you Sale 350, year 350. So he actually calculated, there are several pages between the first and the last page here, which gives you every year, so 350 years, up to the time of Hamza Isfahani, of when the Nowruz occurs during the Hijra calendar. This is important because this is probably the first time, or there may be other earlier examples, but the first significant example of how the Hijra, as the beginning of the solar calendar, incorporated with the idea of Nowruz, which is the most significant marker of the solar calendar. So this, you can see, receives a much of attention in modern times. The one, again, by the Orientalists, largely German Orientalists, in the 19th century. The one that you see is one of the earliest translations of it into Latin, done in Copenhagen in 1817. If I may move, yeah, this way I would be able to better see. Okay, as you can see, this one done by Larsen Rasmussen, a very early Orientalist, Danish Orientalist. The one in the Dane Orientalist. The one in the middle is a first edition, or one of the first edition of the Arabic text done in India, in Calcutta in 1866. And then the one, as you can see, is an advertisement from the famous journal published in Berlin by the Iranian nationalists, by Taqizadeh and the others, Jamalzadeh, Taqizadeh, Qazvini, and the others, in the 1920s. This is the edition I would mention. I brought the advertisement in order to show that how it caught the attention of the Iranian constitutionalists and the post-constitutional period, and the very emergence of the early Iranian nationalism in the early 20th century. This text is a remarkable one in many respects. We don't have time to go through it, but I'm just trying to see how, oh yes, okay then. This is the edition that was done in Berlin by Taqizadeh, or rather by the Kaviani press, which was publishing mostly Persian books, including Nasir Khosrow's travels, numerous plays and so forth of the 19th century, but also did this work in Arabic, this Hamza Isfahani, not without a reason, because precisely of his attention that he pays to the question of the Nowruz and the secular calendar. This was done probably around 1923, at the very end of the period of a group of very important group of Iranians who got together in Berlin during the course of the First World War, and immediately afterwards during the Weimar Germany. And it's important because it shows that Iranians were in contact with the German Orientalists at the time. So this text, as it actually explains in the text itself and the introduction here in Arabic, it says that it was reprinted, it was used, the edition 1844 Leipzig edition by Gutwald, and then it was recommended and discussed by another contemporary of Taqizadeh at the time in Berlin, Mitztuch, that helped him publish this text. So I brought this in order, by the way, this is a very rare edition of Hamza Isfahani's work, probably belonged to Taqizadeh himself, in the former Sena Library in Tehran. Now it's called Majlis Shurai Islami Library. Another work of the same nature and the same period, during this revival, in a sense, one can say a renaissance, and the whole debate about adopting the solar calendar and revival of this tradition of the past, of the Sasanian era, as you can see, is the Nowruzname that was produced, presumably attributed to Omar Khayyam, though we are not sure that indeed is Omar Khayyam, but it's the publications of it which is of significance to us. This was published, edited by Mojtaba Minovi in Tehran, a second generation of the Iranian scholars interested in the past heritage. The publication in Tehran, the press called Kavian, which is in a sense continuation of the Kaviani press in Berlin in 1933, based on the Berlin manuscript that recommended to Minovi by Muhammad Qazvini, who was one of the members of the Berlin group in Weimar Germany, which is remarkable. You can see at the first page, there is a Pahlavi equivalent of the term Nowruzname has been added by Mojtaba Minovi. And also there is a drawing here by the book illustrator and the drawing and the painter Darwish, which was André Severguin, the son of the famous Severguin, the photographer of the 19th century, which I found it also interesting because here is the lion, which tries to tear the presumably the chains of the past and bring about the origins of the Iranian identity here. So I find it a very kind of a remarkable nationalist text as it was produced. All of these were produced at the time when there was a debate about the whole idea of whether this solar calendar of the presumably pagan origin, of the pagan memory of the Sasanian era should be adopted in the 11th century. It's no surprise that you would find of all the people, Muhammad Ghazali, probably the most prominent theologian of the entire Islamic history of Tus in Khorasan, that in his Persian word Kimiyai Saadat produces a passage that I would refer to in which he actually contests the very idea of adopting Nowruz and giving it reverence. You would find it in the work of one of the founders of the modern, if you like, Islamic radicalism, Ibn Taymiyyah, in writing in Damascus in condemnation of the Nowruz. You would find it also in terms of the various clashes that Shiism brought between the concept of the Nowruz renewal and the Shi'i calendar, or the important events of the Shi'i calendar. So in a sense, you would see there is a contestation between the memory of Nowruz, which is a memory of a renewal, and the memories of the martyrdom and the sufferings of the saints in Shiism, that it's very much corresponds to the kind of a sense of eternal mourning that you would see. This is very evident through the early modern times, the Safavid period, and beyond to the Qajar era, and in certain aspects up to the present. You would see that there is a certain tension between these two notions of timekeeping, between these two notions of commemorations and memories of the past. One of the renewal, usually festive, one of martyrdom, it's martyrdom devoid of salvation that you would find in the memory of Muharram or the other events. This is a very crowded, the Shi'i calendar of mourning is a very crowded one, that there are numerous events. I have counted that perhaps a devout Shiite in up to 20th century would have been able to spend probably 1/3 of the year, or 1/4 of the year, possibly even 1/3, in various activities corresponding to the mourning and of the Shiite calendar, including Rozeh, the Ta'ziyah, the Sinezani and Nohe, Ziyarat, and all kinds of other activities that corresponded to the Shi'i calendar, Hijra calendar. And therefore, the clash between these two is very much visible in the minds of Iranians, in a sense, and a certain coexistence, one might say, that this kind of a two-sided calendar, two-sided of timekeeping, and two-sided of the temporal memory is part and parcel of what you would see in Iran up to the 20th century, and the emergence of the alternative calendars. But before getting there, here I wanted to read for you a passage, a very short passage from Ghazali's Kimiyai Saadat, around perhaps the same time that Biruni has written Asar al-Baghiyah, and Ibn Hazm al-Isfahani has produced the Sani al-Muluk that we've discussed earlier on. As you can see on the right, I read the Persian passage and then the translation. اما آنچه برای سده و نوروز فروشند چون شمشیر و سپر چوبین و بوق سفالین این در نفس خود حرام نیست ولیکن اظهار شعار گبران حرام است و مخالف شرع است و هرچه برای آن کنند نشاید بلکه افراط کردن در آراستن بازارها به سبب نوروز و قطایف بسیار کردن probably means wearing new clothing or baking various sweets و تکلف‌های نو افزودن برای نوروز نشاید بلکه نوروز و سده باید که مندرس شود و کسی نام آن نبرد. So this is by an Iranian who is very conscious of its Iranian heritage and nevertheless revolts against it. It's in English translation. Whatever the vendors and shopkeepers are selling, like wooden swords and shields and clay horns for children, though in and of themselves are not prohibited by the Islamic Sharia, but expressions of Zoroastrian rituals or outfits are prohibited and against the Sharia. And whatever else they do for it, that's for Nowruz, is not acceptable. For example, too much decoration of the bazaars for Nowruz and baking too much pastries or putting on new items of clothing for Nowruz is reprehensible. They should be banned until the Nowruz and the Sadeh festival are extinct. That's again remarkable because it's, among other things, shows us that these celebrations were very much in practice throughout the early Islamic period, throughout the medieval period, and modern times. So in effect, the emergence of the Islam and predominance of the Islam barely could suppress this kind of memories of the calendaric memories of the Iranian past. Okay, if we move on further to alternative calendars, among other places, India was in early modern times was a locale for the emergence of these new ideas about calendars. I don't want to go too far into it. I just wanted to use several images because we don't have really that much time. One is the Mughal Emperor Akbar at the second half of the 16th century, who, in a sense, with the idea of Din Elahi, the divine religion, had also introduced presumably some new calendar, in which the idea of a sun as a center, solar calendar, was very important. Here it shows him in reverence of the sun. This is Akbar himself in the Museum of Asian Civilization in Singapore. And equally of significance, in the very end of the 18th century, you would see in the Sultanate of Mysore, during the reign of Tipu Sultan, tragic end in 1799, you would see the emergence of a new calendar called Mauludi calendar that he himself presumably have initiated. There is at the top, you can see the obverse and the reverse of a coin of the period in which he refers to his own capital as Darus Saltaneh Mushtari, named after Saturn. And then at the bottom, you can see an inscription as it appears, I believe it is in, if I may, appears in Bangalore, in one of his palaces in Bangalore, whereby there's this inscription gives you the date of the Mauludi calendar, the solar calendar that he has initiated, with its months named after apparently various dignitaries or various individuals. and the left, you can see, and also at the same time, corresponding to the Hijra calendar. That's one example of the innovations in calendaric that emerged in the early modern times and in the 19th century, as you would see in the next one. Here, I have included a page from Sayyid Ali Muhammad, the Bab, of the new calendar that he initiated, known as the Bayani or Badi calendar, in which he reconfigured basically the calendar according to a sacred order that basically dominates his entire manner of organizing his new religion. This is the system that I spare you from the details, but it puts at the center of it, as you can see here in this diagram, the primal point that is Nuqtaya Ula, as the origins of the system that he had created, he being a reference to himself and the prophetic cycle that he has initiated. And then there is a wahed or a unit around it. I'm sorry that there is an error here. Wahed of 19, and the multiplication of the wahed of 19, the unit of 19, creates 365 that equals to kullu shay, meaning all beings. So in a sense, the system starts with the primal, with a unit, and with 19 units that creates the entire system, in which it applies, when it applies to the calendar, you have 19 months of 19 days. That creates 361 days, plus 5 days or sometimes 4 days. That corresponds to the name of the Bab himself, comes to 365 or 366 days. And the vernal equinox, known as or Nowruz, was recognized, as you could see in the text here, as the day of God. It's significant because not only Shiraz has been, the land of Fars has been considered as the mother of the lands and the sacred land, but also the calendar starts with Nowruz. So in a sense, moving away from the Hijra to the creation of a new calendar that based on himself and the letters of the living of the 18 altogether creates the first unit of the 19. This, irrespective of the fact that whether this calendar was practical or not, it's significant because of its symbolic feature, as I just pointed out. Moving further, in the course of the late 19th century, temporal timekeeping becomes more of a modern contingency. And official calendars as a tool of disciplining society. This becomes much more evident in the late 19th century, as I'm going to mention a few examples. And there, the fact that the Copernican revolution becomes more known to the non-Europeans, including the Iranians, that also plays a part in the way that the conceptions of time changes. And the way that, as a result of that, Iran of the late 19th century gradually manages to merge the two notions of the Hijra as the beginning of the calendar, that is Prophet's emigration from Mecca to Medina, and the solar calendar of the ancient times. It's a kind of a very remarkable feature that happens in the late 19th century and early 20th century during the post-constitutional period. And not the adaptation of the Christian era. It is probably inspired by the Christian era, but it's not the adaptation of it as it happens in some other countries of the region. Iran manages probably and Afghanistan following Iran, is the only country that adopts its own solar calendar and does not does not adopt the Christian calendar, as it happens in Egypt, as it happens in the Arab world, as it happens in Turkey. Now, this is the image that I have included in the poster for this talk. On the left, you see the earliest example of the year 1265 Hijra Shamsi. This is a solar calendar, corresponding to the year 1303, 1304 of the Hijra Qamari calendar, and corresponding to 1887 Christian era, whereby the first time you find in some of the Qajar customary calendars, you would find, referred to as the Salama, the almanacs, you would find a reference to the Shamsi calendar. This is presumably the earliest. Although probably around the same time, that is around the 1880s, when the Belgians were hired or rather commissioned to run the Iranian customs for import-export, the significance of the solar computation of time becomes very important, because that's how you would do it in the modern fashion. And therefore, you can see that there is a coincidence between the emergence of this in the solar calendar, in the typical Salame. As you can see, in the Salame, there are various columns that gives you the signs of the zodiac and gives you all the activities that it's good or reprehensible during the days of the week or the days of the month. And this Salame was very popular, even up to now, they are still produced. But the inclusion of the solar is significant. By 1272, Hijri Shamsi again, of the solar calendar, you would see that the year of the solar calendar has given priority to the Hijri calendar. So it's a سال 1272 هجری شمسی، it's a تقویم فارسیه، سال 1272 هجری شمسی مطابق دوم رمضان 1310 هجری قمری. And this done with the signs of zodiac around it, which corresponds to the solar months of the Iranian calendar. And done by Fazil al-Kamil al-Nahrir Ali Muhammad Abdul Ghaffar Isfahani. He was the chief astronomer or astrologer of the Nasiruddin Shah period, who is a remarkable example of an Iranian scientist who shifts gradually from the old traditional way of computation time and timekeeping to the modern one. He indeed probably should be considered as one of the great scientists of the 19th century Iran. Here he is on the left. You can see Najmul Mulk, later on Najmul Dole, who lived between 1844 and 1909 and produced numerous works. He is the one who initiated the first map of the city of Tehran with the help of he drew the first map with the help of the students in Dar al-Funun. He was an instructor of exact sciences in Dar al-Funun, including geometry, mathematics, astronomy, and so on, and produced numerous works, including the one you can see, comparative Hijri and Christian calendars. He created a Risale Tatbiqiyeh, published in 1904. This is at the very outset of the very end of the Muzaffaruddin Shah period, whereby, as he points out, to facilitate the works of the translators as another indication of how now it's important to maintain a very exact and accurate calendar that corresponds the time in the Iranian calendar to the Europeans. And then he gives in the introduction why he has produced this, and then produced various columns here, as you can see, dates of the Hijra calendar corresponding to what dates of the Christian calendar. He does also a book in Hayat va Nujum Jadid called Bidayat al-Nujum, so the Elementary Astronomy. which is a remarkable work in the sense that, first of all, as you can see here, I chose for you a page which shows again the equinox and the etidalain, the autumnal and the vernal equinox, the beginning of the spring, the beginning on the fall, and explains it in the way that it appeared, and I showed you in the earlier diagram. And then he gives an extensive this detail of how this should be calculated. What is remarkable about this work is that he, as he points out in the introduction, he uses modern astronomy, European astronomy, mostly 19th century French texts, Vernet and Clément, that they are well-known textbooks of astronomy. But he does it his own way. He in a sense, revises the text. And as a matter of fact, numerous commentaries that he makes, he tries to correct some of the errors that he finds in the French text. And more so, it's important because of the fact that he uses the Persian traditional, the Iranian or Islamic, Arabic, Iranian astronomy terminology in the translation of the text extremely successfully. And it's an example of how this adaptation of European knowledge in the 19th century could be done with certain skill and mastery, as in the case of Najm al-Mulk. He produced also the first statistics of Tehran, Nufus Darukhrafe Tehran, which was published in Nasiruddin Shah's era. He produced a very famous monograph about this province of Khuzestan, where again Nasiruddin Shah sent him off to write this very extensive and nicely done account of the province of Khorasan, province of Khuzestan. Both of them, significance of the fact that how this hybrid between the traditional knowledge and modern European knowledge was achieved in the 19th century. Now, coming to the latter part of my talk, the last few minutes perhaps, you see, but by the time of the Constitutional Revolution, the debate about adopting of this official solar calendar for Iran, no longer like the time of Najm al-Mulk is one of several calendars, but the prime calendar for the purpose of bureaucracy, fiscal year, and taxation was produced around the time of the Constitutional Revolution. There's a need for rationalization on the eve of the fiscal reforms. This is just before the coming of the Morgan Schuster's famous mission to Iran that created such a turmoil and led to the end of the second Majlis. This comes with the rise of the conscious Iranian nationalism in this time period of constitutional and revival of national memory that you can see in numerous ways in the literature of the constitutional period and after. 1909 is important, particularly because this is the end of the so-called the lesser despotism, istibdad saghir, whereby the nationalists, constitutionalists fought against the royalists and managed to defeat and conquer Tehran and create the second Majlis. And in a sense, defeat the clerical conservatives and the Qajar royalist conservatives that were not in favor of that kind of a substantive reform. The person who was particularly remarkable in this regard is Abdul Hussein Shaybani Wahidul Mulk, with a very interesting career. Educated at Cambridge in history, and later on a professor in Tehran University. Very active among the Democrats during the first and the second Majlis, a correspondent of the Times of London in Tehran, and the one who insisted on the legislation of for the fiscal accounting of what he refers to as the Shamsiye Borji, that is the calendar, solar calendar of months of the zodiac. This was the legislation was passed from the second Majlis in 22nd of February 1911, and this is the first time in the part of the law of accounting. This is the first time that this solar calendar was officially adopted. And again, the role of the government in regulating the timekeeping here. I'm sorry. This comes in a sense as a alternative calendar, or not only alternative calendar, but the official calendar and the abolition of the alternative calendars. That is the Hijri calendar, the Qamari, the lunar calendar, which has been in use in the official documentations prior to that time, and also the Turkish calendar of the 12 cycles, that also Turkish Chinese calendar of 12 cycles, that throughout the Safavid and more so in the Qajar period was in use. Then by the fifth Majlis, that is around 1925, when the change of the dynasty occurs, the very beginning of the Pahlavi era, you would see that there is a second legislation in which the solar Khorshidi calendar, Hijri Khorshidi calendar, with the beginning of the calendar starting in Hijra and continued on the basis of the Iranian months that now changed the names to Zoroastrian names for the months, in March 31st, 1925, in which several figures were playing very significant part. In addition to Wahid al-Mulk, you would see Hassan Taqizadeh, as I pointed out, and the Kaveh Journal in Berlin earlier on, that highly advocated the solar calendar and the Nowruz. And then Keykhosrow Shahrukh, the representatives of the Zoroastrian community in the second Majlis, who indeed was instrumental in the choice of the names of the months as we know them today, and from the Zoroastrian origin, and yes, as a matter of fact, some resistance by the clerical establishment. Now, finally, if I make some conclusions here, the first point is the survival of the Iranian calendar. That's, I think, my presentation shows that how the solar calendar survives for not only for functional reasons, but for the fact that the state, in effect, dominates the way that the timekeeping has been practiced in the Iranian world. Not only Iran, but some of the neighboring lands, among the Kurds, among the Alevis of the Anatolia, among the, of course, the Tajiks of the Afghanistan, and the Tajikistan in Central Asia, prior to that, the whole of Central Asia, as a matter of fact. That also, second point is that how this corresponds to the collective memory of the Iranians, and how this actually contributed to the emergence of the sense of modern Iranian identity as we know it today. And how Nowruz, in effect, is a chief marker for this Iranian identity. This is not just a festival, but in a sense of Iranians recognizing this long memory to which I have referred earlier on. And the state as the upholder of the solar calendar, as I just pointed out. And also the fact that modern contingencies tend to reinforce this sense of temporal accuracy, and therefore the endurance and the revival as an official calendar in modern times. and how significant it is also that it brought together both the solar calendar, merged together the solar calendar with the Hijra era. So the beginning is no longer the accession of the ruler. It is not changed with the accession of one ruler to the other, but it's, in a sense, is a sacred date as far as the majority of the population in Iran is concerned, and that is the Hijra. And this helped its kind of sanctification as a acceptable calendar for all Iranians. And in a sense, it met the test of the time, as it, in a sense, the Shahanshahi calendar that was introduced in our living memory in 1976, the Iranian 1355 Shamsi calendar, 2535 Shahanshahi calendar, that was probably a major contributor to the outrage that led to the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And as a matter of fact, the attempts in the early days of the Islamic Revolution to try to revert the calendar back to the Hijri calendar. Neither of them managed to survive. And as a matter of fact, the calendar that seemed to have come out of a democratic process in the early part of the Constitution, during the Constitutional Revolution, is the one that survived up to today. And in a sense, up to now, we can see that how, in a sense, the celebration of the Nowruz and other festivals, more so, as you can see, the Yalda festival, not so much the Sadeh or Mehregan, but other festivals are becoming very much part of the today's Iranian awareness of themselves as a culture and an identity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that lovely and very, very interesting presentation, Dr. Amanat. Before we get into the next section, I'd like to explain how this will work. So we will have a Q&A coming up, and for those of you who have questions, you can send those in the chat. You can post them in the Q&A, or you can email those questions to media@iran1400.org. And before we get into that, we have a quick teaser that we're going to play before the Q&A. All right, y'all again can just ask your questions in the Q&A. And while we wait for those questions to trickle in, I wanted to ask one. I'd like to ask about the adoption of the solar calendar and the abolition of alternative calendars. When you wrote that that happened in 1925, obviously that year stuck out to me, thinking about a change from the Qajar to the Pahlavi dynasty. I'm curious what the mood was like leading up to that change, as well as what the debate looked like for adopting or officially abolishing alternative calendars.
A very pertinent and important question. If you look back, as I pointed out or hinted at in my talk, ever since the beginning of the century, even prior to the Constitutional Revolution, but certainly during and after the Constitutional Revolution, that is from 1906 to 1911, and from 1911 to 1925, you would see a conscious awareness of the sense of Iranian identity and Iranian calendar as part of Iranian identity. For instance, if you look, I'll just give you one example. If you look at, for instance, the famous newspaper or periodical that was produced during the first part of the Constitutional Revolution, Sur Israfil, that to which the famous Iranian journalist and scholar Ali Akbar Dehkhoda contributed, and it was edited by Sur Israfil himself. That is, the first name escapes me, by Shirazi, who was one of the martyrs of actually the constitutional period. You can see that at the legend of the paper, it gives you 3 dates. It gives you, I didn't have time to include that into my presentation. It gives you the Yazdegirdi date, that is the old Zoroastrian calendar. It gives you the Hijra date. It gives you the Christian date. It does not give you the modern solar calendar that we use. This is very significant of the fact, and that's one of numerous examples, that Iranians are appealing back to the Sasanian or pre-Islamic past and the memories of the pre-Islamic past. In the poetry of Eshqi, you can find that. In the poetry of Bahar, you can find that. In the numerous other examples of the writings of the period, you can see, that is the constitutional period, this interest in pre-Islamic times. So the welcoming of the solar calendar as one of the legacies of that past is the way that this becomes more conscious and, in a sense, defines the society along, one might say, their religious or nationalist inclinations. The Hijra calendar remains much more in the time of the constitutional and post-constitutional time, and certainly after 1925, as a representation of the religious establishment and the timekeeping of the religious establishment, and closely tied to the mourning ceremonies of Muharram, to other days of mourning in the Shi'i calendar, whereas the dates associated with the solar calendar is much more nationalistic, much more representative of the Iranian identity. This continues all the way through the constitutional period. And certainly, as I pointed out, after 1909, there is with the greater pronouncement, you would find this. Certainly 1911 is a very good example of that, and the adaptation of the solar calendar. But by 1921, the rise of Reza Khan to power, and certainly by 1925, the beginning of the Pahlavi dynasty, you would see that there is a conscious attempt on the side of the government this time to try to instill this sense of an Iranian national identity into, as part of the solar calendar, the ancient Iranian calendar, into this narrative of nationalism. You would find it on the stamps, you would find it on the flag, you would find it on the reveration for the Zoroastrian period, you would find it in many of the visual representations of Iranians past in the early Pahlavi period, in carpets, that's in rugs, in books, in the creation of a new Shahnameh, the continuity of the Ferdowsi Shahnameh, Shahnameh Nobakht, and so forth. So numerous facades into this sense of a national identity, of which calendar is one.
Fascinating, Dr. Amanat. Thank you. And our next question is from Mujan Momin. Thank you for your excellent presentation. Could you give more details on why Khomeini, who presumably wanted the Qamari calendar, was not able to impose this despite his total authority over the country. And after that, there's another question, but I can ask that later.
Very pertinent question, Dr. Momen. I think, as I just hinted at, there was a desire on the side. If you look at some of the early announcements by Khomeini and some of the other clerical figures in 1979 or 1978-79, actually, prior to the success of the revolution, you would see that many of them, if not all of them, were actually dated with the Qamari calendar, with the Hijra calendar, Hijra lunar calendar, as opposed to the solar calendar. And perhaps you can see that probably if you could have had his own way, there would have been an adoption of the Hijra calendar, Hijra Qamari calendar, lunar calendar. But it became almost immediately apparent as soon as the formation of the Islamic Republic that this is totally impractical and unrealistic. So even Khomeini was convinced that this is no way that that old calendar could be returned to be adopted as the official calendar of Iran. This is the first probably sign how certain features of Iranian identity could not have been easily changed, even with the emergence of a radical and traumatic experience as the Islamic revolution. And for that matter, now 40 odd years later, if you look back, you would see that there are so many of these aspects of Iranian identity and memory that has resisted any conscious attempt on the side of the Iranian regime to Islamicize, so-called, the way that they wanted it to be. So that narrative seems to have lost much of its power, although it's, in certain respect, it has to manage through the textbooks, through distortions of the historical past, give a vision to the Iranians that is so-called quote-unquote Islamic. But certainly, in many respects, it seems that it has lost its claimed power to try to transform cultural Iran. That's a short answer. Maybe there are some insights into specific reasons why in that time period he was advised not to adopt his Hijri lunar calendar again. Sometimes you would see in his later announcements or notices, he would enter both the solar calendar and the lunar calendar together. And then, of course, after 1989, there is no mention of the lunar calendar. Even the Islamic Republic makes a very significant effort to try to promote the Shi'i calendar, increase the number of the days of mourning, Matam, in the calendar, including Dahe Fatemiyeh. That is something completely invented or reinvented in the Islamic Republic in order to highlight the significance of Shiism. But what matters for the majority of the Iranian people is Nowruz and these Iranian aspects, rather than, although one should bear in mind that that sacred Shi'i calendar, particularly the first 10 days of the Muharram, are something very significant in the Iranian awareness. One should not completely rule it out altogether. So this coexistence and the tension between these two myths of Nowruz and the solar renewal, and the theme of mourning for the, one might say, suffering and the martyrdom or failed martyrdom, or a martyrdom without salvation of the Shi'i calendar persist.
Thank you, Dr. Amanat. And it's really interesting to see that dual identity come out in this way. The next question is a follow-up also, I believe, from Mujan Momin. And the question is, if there were any major Islamic ulama in the 19th and early 20th century who objected to adopting the pre-Islamic calendar, and if there were, how did the proponents of adopting the pre-Islamic calendar respond to their objection?
Thank you. Again, a great question. I think after 1909 and the defeat of the Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, and his, of course, later on, his execution by the committee by which both Tagizadeh and Wahidul Mulk, to which I've referred, were members. The Commission Muwaqqat, which was acting as a kind of a revolutionary government during after the conquest of Tehran in 1909. After that, that debate was disappeared, basically. There was no organized resistance to the adoption of the solar calendar, because these two major sources of support for the traditional system of multi-calendars that existed in the Qajar period, the Qajar monarchy and the clerical establishment, both were weakened. Later on, during the debates of the second Majlis, you see some resistance on the side of the more conservative members of the representatives in the Majlis, but not very significant, not very outspoken. Then probably later on, particularly after the Second World War, from 1945 onwards, not immediately after the end of the war, but certainly during this very exciting period of the post-war era up to 1953 and after, you can see that there are gestures on the side of the religious establishment to reassert the Shi'i calendar and the significance of the Shi'i calendar. You would find numerous not fatwas, but announcements by major ayatollahs or by minor religious figures in the provinces who warn the believers that since in certain years, for instance, Nowruz coincides with the beginning of the Muharram, therefore the celebration of Nowruz is reprehensible. Or numerous other examples of how these sacred events of the calendar, of the Shi'i calendar, should be upheld, including many ways of mourning that is specifically pointed out, including Khomeini in the post-revolutionary times. But even prior to that, we can find in the writings of Burujerdi, some of his announcements, you find the same thing that emphasizes that how significant these events of the Shi'i calendar are for preservation of the Iranian Shi'i identity. So in that regard, you can see that the tension continues up to the present. Even up to now, you would see that there is this deliberate attempt on the side of the government in Iran today to try to ban, for instance, some of the activities during Charshambeh Suri that they would consider as non-Islamic. Is one of several examples of these clashes of the calendars that still continues.
Thank you, Dr. Amanat. The next question, what was the main impact of various calendars' adoption on Iranian identity? And to what extent is Islamic identity a part of Iranian identity?
Well, I presume I have, to some extent, responded to that. But let me emphasize, Iran, like many other societies, one should not expect a singular kind of identity or sense of loyalty. So like other societies, Iran could have this kind of a diverse identity. So in one respect, it could have great respect and fascination and pride in the pre-Islamic identity of Iran, as I tried to mention in numerous examples in medieval times, but also remain loyal to the Shia side of it, or to the religious side of it, or for that matter, to other religious identities. It's not necessarily always a Shia identity. Could be Armenian, could be Jewish, could be Baha'i. All of these identities are also present. And therefore, one should not expect that everything should be actually standardized in such a fashion that people only believe in one identity or one way of maintaining their own sense of temporal time. And remember, sacred time is different from the official time. And therefore, the calendars could be determined, could be decided on which aspect you are emphasizing. And of course, as I pointed out, in the Qajar period, for official purposes, not only there was a great degree of confusion, because not only the Hijri calendar, Hijri Qamari calendar, was in use, but also there was a Chinese, Turkish, Mongolian calendar. There's a 12-year cycle named after animals. That was Ut-il, Ud-il, Tanguzil, and so forth, that named after the animals and was used in the official documents. Sometimes you come across many of the documents of the Qajar period whereby you have to do a lot of work in order to figure out which cycle this particular date corresponds to in the Turkish calendar. This is because it could be over a period of 50 years, 4 cycles of this Turkish calendar. So you have to find out which one you are referring to. Qajars were anxious to keep it because it was part of their ancestral identity, that is. But that's, in a sense, part of the reason why there is emphasis on the adoption of an official calendar of solar nature is because of its being regulated. Is an accurate calendar, which in the Iranian context, over a period of a very long time, it maintained this kind of an agricultural cycle. So you can see in Achaemenid times, the Iranians first adopted, presumably, the Babylonian calendar, which was a lunar solar calendar, but then shifted after a while to the Egyptian calendar, which was solar. It's ancient Egyptian calendar, which was solar, when it became part of their empire. And then this idea of solar lunar remained throughout a feature.
Thank you, Dr. Amanat, for that insight. The next question from Mohammed Reza Haeri is, I would like to know about the reflections of people and the situation of social acceptance on solar calendar and Nowruz, which I know we've touched on. Do you have anything else to add?
Well, Mohammed Reza Haeri, thank you very much for the question. I'm sure you have a great insight from the Persian literature yourself, and I wish you could have actually recited some of the poetry related to Nowruz. As you can see in Persian literature from the Qasida of the Samanid period, that is from the 10th century, earlier 11th century onwards, in numerous openings or the prologue to the Qasida is referred to as the Bahariya. These are the spring vernal celebrations in the Qasida. And then, of course, it's transformed into become Ghazal later on, in which the celebration of the spring is very much part and parcel. Even up to 19th century Nasiruddin Shah's court, you would find that the poet laureate, Malik al-Shu'ara, would recite a Qasida in honor of the ruler, in which starts with the introduction, the Bahariya, the prologue, in description of the spring. So, and then of course in the Ghazal later on, you would find numerous examples of references to Nowruz, and to, of course, even more than Nowruz, to Bahar. So it's celebration of the cycle of time, a cycle of the year, is always something that is of fascination to this literary tradition, much more than it was in the Arabic. Even in the Arabic, if you look at the Arabic poetry of the early Islamic times, you see many of the Arab poets or poets in the Arabic language are those who either were Iranians themselves or were part or somehow were exposed to that culture. So in a sense, this idea of closeness to the nature, this idea of celebrating the spring is something that is part of this old tradition that probably goes back. It's not without a reason that you saw on that image of the Shahnameh, whereby Barbad sitting atop of a tree, celebrating the Nowruz and celebrating the spring, as the setting would clearly show you. So renewal of the spring is something of a great importance, both symbolically and in terms of its environmental, ecological aspect, and of course its agricultural aspect.
Thank you. The next question or questions from Joanna de Groot is, greetings and thanks for a deep and challenging argument. Why do you use the singular term identity rather than plural identities to suggest the many-sided ways in which Iranians have understood themselves? Might it be useful to think of the agricultural calendar as well as lived in some parts of Iran? The harvest comes way before the autumn equinox. Would it help to consider the intersections as well as the oppositions between Islamic and pre-Islamic calendars and cycles as expression of complexer hybrid identities?
Thank you very much, Dr. de Groot, for this wonderful and challenging, as you yourself pointed out, comment. Yes, I very much tend to agree with you that in effect, we cannot talk about one identity, but identities. The reason why perhaps there was a greater emphasis, perhaps unwanted, to identity is that this is the one which was adopted by the state. And they tend to believe that because of the calendar is a regulator that disciplines the society through state manages, a tool of the state to regulate the society. Therefore, this is one official identity that often has been an expression of the power of the center versus the periphery. And you are right, the geographical periphery may indicate different time cycles, different seasonal cycles for the agricultural production. But nevertheless, the one that dominates the calendar is the one that it's determined time and again by the state, both in pre-Islamic times and in the Islamic times. So in effect, what I'm trying to say is that, yes, these identities did exist, But the challenge became far more significant when the lunar calendar of Islam, that necessarily was not an agricultural calendar, was introduced into the Iranian environment. And Iran has to tackle and manage the coexistence of these two kinds of timekeeping. One which was based on the functional aspect of it through agriculture, through the change of the seasons, one that was introduced because of sacred reasons that was associated with the Hijri calendar. And I think what I'm arguing, and you helped me actually to articulate that, is that by the end, probably from the 11th century onwards, in the works of Hamza Isfahani, for instance, or Biruni, all the way to the 20th century, eventually reconciling these two calendars, reconciling these two notions of timekeeping in the solar Hijra calendar, was a way that Iranians tried to deal with the problem of the tension between the two identities. And of course, you're absolutely right that, as I said, I'm not an expert in the calendaric, which by itself is a fascinating field. And one can look at various calendars from various parts of Iran that tend to give a different time and different identities. And again, point out that in modern times, with the rationalization of state, greater degree of centralization, it's not a surprise that from the 1921 onwards, from 1911 onwards, actually, and certainly by 1925, there is an official calendar which indicates or advocates a certain sense of a collective identity, because this is the process of centralization. As the state shifts from Mamalik Mahruse idea to an idea of a Keshvar Iran or Dolat Aliyeh Iran, and then Keshvar Iran, then you see that this sense of the greater integration into the calendar reflects that. So that's why we probably needs to talk more about one identity that has been pronounced and has been implemented by the state, for better or for the worse. That is how usually the official calendars emerge. I mean, this is a debate that can go on with Dr. de Groot and the others for a while, because probably I'm sure he has other comments in response.
You know, if we had all day, I would love to hear that debate continue. The next question is from Gholam Reza Vatandust. Dear Professor Amanat, would you say the imperial calendar, Shah-e-Shani, implemented in 1975, had a significant impact in fueling the Islamic Revolution of 1979?
Thank you very much, Dr. Vatandust. Thank you for listening to my talk. And this goes actually for the others. This is a fascinating question. Yes, as I pointed out, this sense of a merger and reconciliation between these two sources of Iranian identity and its Shiite identity or Islamic identity, that tends to occur very early, from the year probably around the 11th century onwards, or perhaps even earlier, is a kind of a way that to reconcile these two identities that cannot be easily removed, that cannot be easily obliterated. And I think the attempt of the creation of the Shahanshah calendar, the imperial calendar of Muhammad Reza Shah, was an awkward mistake on the side of the state, if I may say, to try to tamper with this well-set kind of a merger between these two notions of time, between the sacred time and the ancient Iranian time. And it's, in a sense, guaranteed resistance by even the secular Iranians, not even to say anything about the more religious sectors of the Iranian population, but something that was considered as an attempt of the authority to force down the throat of the Iranians a new concept that didn't make sense. The greater glorification of the ancient Iranian past that was part of the narrative of the Pahlavi state. And to some extent, it was accepted, to some extent, shaped Iran of the Pahlavi period. Nobody can deny that. Nobody can deny that the creation of the Musée Iran Bastan, the Iranian Iran Bastan Museum, the adaptation of the calendar, the creation of or veneration of various aspects of Iranian past, pre-Islamic past, played a very important part in the way that Iranians came to know themselves. Even today, if you ask to ordinary Iranian, what is it that makes you Iranian? Probably one of the earliest things that they would tell you is that we belong to this long, ancient civilization called Iran, and they always go back to its origins. So yes, in certain respect, it did transform Iran. But the attempt to change the calendar was something much more sensitive and much more difficult. Of course, nobody knows. A historian would tell you if there wouldn't have been a revolution, God knows, in 100 years' time, probably the year of the Shahanshah calendar would have persisted. But one area which I have resisted pointing out to you is that, resisted because of the time, is that there are two, at least, attempts in the course of Iranian history, one during the Seljuk period with the Jalali calendar, which is a magnificent calendar and the origin of what we have today as our solar calendar, and the other one, the Qazani calendar or the Khani calendar of the Ilkhanid period. Both of them remarkably significant in the way that they regulated the timekeeping in a most effective fashion, particularly the Jalali calendar. And it has a fascinating story of its own. We don't have time to deal with it. Both of these, in a sense, because they were based on the idea of beginning of the era with the accession of the ruler, the Jalali calendar with Malik Shah Seljuqi, the Qazani calendar with the accession of Qazan, or presumably even Genghis Khan himself, but Qazan definitely. Both of these calendars, in effect, had a limited survival. Though Jalali calendar did remain in Iranian memory and in Iranian timekeeping, the calendar that I showed you of Najm al-Mulk in the 19th century still has a column which is a Jalali calendar. But Jalali calendar never was adopted. It was referred to in the literature. You would find in Saadi's poetry too. But it's not a calendar that was adopted by this modern state because it was based on the accession of Malik Shah. The Hijri calendar persisted because it managed to adopt these two aspects of the Hijra and the ancient memory of the calendar, Iranian calendar, together. And certainly, yes, you are right by pointing out that it was one of several factors in the way that the discontent against the excesses of the Pahlavi period became evident.
Thank you for that insightful response. The next question is semi-related. Are there anywhere in Ghazali writings to appreciate past Iranian culture?
Thank you very much. It's a great question. I wonder, is there a particular name associated with it? Okay.
Let's see.
Oh, all right. Never mind. That's all right. I'm not an expert of Ghazali's writing. and he was an extremely prolific author and scholar that has produced, of course, major texts that are essential for what we would call Islam today, particularly the Sunni world. But I would very much doubt that anywhere he would have had any kind of a pride or respect for Nowruz per se. The passage that I quoted for you, the latter part of it, it actually is even more daunting, because he actually points out that even attempts to try to forget the Nowruz should not be attempted, because he says that there are certain believers who during the Nowruz festival, during the first day of Nowruz, they fast, you see. And they say fasting during Nowruz is also wrong because it reminds you more of the Nowruz than try to forget about it. So you should, and he points out that Nowruz should be treated as yet another day of the calendar. No mention, no memory, nothing. So I think with that kind of description, of course, he writes this for the Iranian audience because his Persian work, Kimiyai Saadat, is not his other works, most of it in Arabic. There are some other Persian works, but most of other works is in Arabic. And in those, Ihya al-Ulum al-Din and so forth, that in those, I doubt that there would be a reference particularly to Nowruz. Ibn Taymiyyah is also fascinating because you would have expected that Ibn Taymiyyah sitting in Damascus under the Mamluks has nothing to do with Ilkhanid Iran of his own time. Why he is so particularly hostile to Nowruz? I think part of the reason is that Nowruz was actually celebrated and observed beyond Iran as far as Syria and Egypt during the Fatimid period. And the Fatimid themselves, although the first was tolerant towards celebration of Nowruz, then they gradually turned against it. And then in the post-Fatimid period, the Mamluk period, this greater emphasis on the sense of Islamic identity that comes with Ibn Taymiyyah and then continues with Ibn Abdul Wahhab in the 18th century and in the 19th century with others and up to the present, is regarding this sense of Iranian emphasis or memory of the Nowruz as something threatening, as something that challenges the idea of the sacredness of Islam. He says that this is the feast of the pagans, and therefore should not be remembered. It should not be celebrated. Also, let me just point this out: that celebration of Nowruz, you would find numerous poetry of the medieval Arabic that it's in celebration of Nowruz. So, in a sense, it's beyond Iran that this kind of a recognition of Nowruz becomes so significant. And certainly, the solar calendar somehow remains. There is a famous, report about the Caliphate of Omar in year 17 of Hijrah, that when their early correspondence with some of the Muslim conquerors or the generals of the Muslim army in various parts, there is no date on them. So they have to adopt a certain system in order to date the correspondence. And the Hijrah presumably appears first as a result of this necessity. But then, of course, it was pointed out, presumably by Hormozan, who was this general of the Sasanian army that surrenders to Omar and becomes one of his advisors, presumably, that he points out that, well, if you are dealing with the countries in which agriculture is important, you should recognize that there should be a certain calendar that identifies the beginning of the spring and so forth. And therefore, the earliest adoption of the solar calendar in the Islamic period, going back to the 1st century, whether it's Omar's time or not, it's questionable, but is a calendar that is referred to as the Kharaji calendar, the tax calendar of the early Islamic part. That is a solar calendar. And therefore, its persistence from the Sasanian times to Islamic times continues. And in many authors, reference to it is to the Yazdegirdi calendar. So the accession of the Yazdegird III at the very end of the Sasanian period is still observed throughout the Islamic period up to the Jalali calendar and beyond. Because the Zoroastrians, of course, were still around. There were plenty of them in the early Islamic centuries. And therefore, the sense of an identity, the sense of a recognition of the Yazdegirdi calendar was very much in place.
Thank you for that response. That question was posed by Behruz Mina, by the way.
Thank you.
And before we move on to our next questions, I wanted to let the audience know we have 3 more questions lined up. Unfortunately, that's about how much we can take in for the rest of the event due to time, which, like I said before, we would be happy to continue this event for hours and hours as long as Dr. Amanat would have us. However, if you have more questions, we'd be more than happy to work with Dr. Amanat if he's willing to get those answered for you. You can send those questions to media@iran1400.org, and we could then forward them to Dr. Amanat, and he could try to get an answer back for you. And we are thrilled that we've had so many questions come in, and sad that we cannot answer all of them, but we do have 3 more lined up. Our next question is from Mansour Farhang. Is there a public opinion research in recent years concerning the preferences of post-revolution generations about the duality of timekeeping or celebration of festivals?
It's a great question to which I'm afraid I don't have any clear answer. I know that there are some unofficial attempts to try to gauge the Iranian ideas and tendencies in 40 years into the revolution. There is one that I came across done in Netherlands by a group of scholars, and the answers are remarkable because some of them would show how far Iranians have moved away from the Islamic ideology of the Islamic Republic, and certainly a great sector of the Iranians, segment of the Iranian population, right opposed to it. So I would not be surprised that a sense of the sense of questioning and rejecting or resisting the predominance of the religious calendar as it is being practiced now in the Islamic Republic is very much in the air. I'm not saying that the pro-Shi'i, irrespective of the Iranian, of the Islamic Republic, I think, yes, there is still a great deal of sympathy for the celebrations of Muharram, for other sacred days in the Shi'i calendar. There is no doubt about it. But I think the way that there is this deliberate attempt on the side of the government to try to force a certain narrative associated with this calendar, both through the textbooks, through the media, through various promotion of activities of the Muharram era through the kind of festival that was created out of the Arba'in, this kind of a procession of more than 1 million or so people from Iran all the way to Karbala and back. That has become, at least pre-COVID days, something that attracted presumably a lot of Iranians of various walks of life into this kind of a festive activity during the Arba'in. Maybe a very deliberate or very clever way on the side of the regime to try to turn a mourning ceremony into some kind of a festive activity. The same can be said about some of the Noha that accompanies the processions during the Muharram, which some of them apparently, from what I've listened to, the tunes either are from some of the songs of the Pahlavi era or some of the popular music of today that has been adopted to the Nohe, and in order to try to make it a little bit more jolly and jazzy top, if you like to call it, for the younger Iranian generations. But I always think to myself, how far this is part of that sacred tradition and that at least my generation would have felt is associated with activities such as Muharram, with all its terrifying aspects of it within the Taziyah or more so within the processions of the Daste and all the other activities that is associated with it, still was something different from what we would witness today. This kind of a surreal mixture that is presented to Iranians today seem to me necessarily is not for reverentiation of the martyrdom of Hussein and the story of Karbala. It's more for the purpose of elevating the sacredness of the Islamic Republic and its ideology. I don't know how much I've answered Dr. Farhang's question. It was a fascinating question. Thank you very much.
And that was a fascinating answer. Thank you. Our next question is from Jane Lewison. In some of the early journals notable to fiqh, they've
Yes.
3 dates that Persian solar, Hijri, lunar, and Western calendar. Do you have an idea why they thought it necessary to give those 3 dates? I hope that made sense.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewison, for that question. If I understand it, I don't know which text of jurisprudence you are referring to, in which there is a reference. Can you repeat the question again, please?
Yes.
Where is it? If it's in your list, I presume somewhere here.
Yes, it is. It should be in our list. In some of the early journals, notable to fiqh.
Oh, Tawfiq, that's right.
Tawfiq.
Yes.
Was that my pronunciation?
Yes, Tawfiq. Notable
Okay.
Tawfiq is a journal. Okay. It's a
Okay.
satirical journal.
Okay. That's
Yes.
You can blame that on my my
Yes, that's
Farsi
right.
accent.
The 3 dates, the Persian solar, Hijri, lunar, and Western calendar. Do you have? Yes, as I pointed out, that's actually very remarkable. Yes, Tawfiq is the tail end of a series of the satirical or political journals that starts from the time of the Constitutional Revolution and continues to the mid-Pahlavi era. In this, well, actually, first of all, thank you very much for noticing that there are 3 calendars mentioned in there. I think the mention of the Hijri calendar, the Qamari calendar, is out of respect and reverence for the Shi'i calendar, sacred Shi'i calendar of Iran, for the Islamic tradition in Iran. Of course, the solar calendar is for the reason that it's the official calendar of the country. And the Christian calendar, I think it's all, again, part of this old tradition of trying to make themselves a little bit more universal or open-minded or inclusive. So they would have all the various multiple timekeeping in mind and be tolerant of all of them. I think that's the reason that comes to my mind. As I said, for instance, in the journals of the early constitutional revolution, you would find that kind of a emphasis on 3 calendars is very evident. Or for that matter, the journal Kaveh that was published in Berlin has also the calendar, the solar calendar, Iranian solar calendar, the Christian calendar, and I believe also the Hijri calendar. I'm not quite sure, but I think it has all 3 of them.
Thank you for that, Dr. Amanat. And with that, we come on to our last question. And it's a very timely question. Professor, can you talk about when and how the Haft-Seen table began?
Well, fascinating, and it's an entirely, it requires another session, perhaps with an expert. To the extent that I know, the origins of the Haft-Seen goes back presumably to pre-Islamic Iran, when in the celebration of the Nowruz, as part of this reverence for the vernal equinox and the beginning of the growing season, there were representations of a number of plants and seeds on the sofre or table for the festival of Nowruz. Sabze, that is, that they were presumably 7, I'm not quite sure, sabze that were placed on the table in order to, if you like to call it, a symbolic reverence and respect for the renewal of the season. In Iranian world, as you would find, for instance, in the Shahnameh, the Iranian world, there was always a great deal of fear, if you like, or concern about the coldness of the winter. So Iran, being in the temperate zone, was not like Norway or Scandinavia that sometimes celebrates the winter season. In Iran, therefore, coming out of the winter into the spring was a sense of a relief. And because it's the beginning of the growing season, representation of these 7 different seeds for the 7 different grains for the future of the seasonal, for the beginning of the season was important, because apparently the idea of throwing the growth of the sabze into the water, as it happens on the 13th day of the Nowruz up to now, was in a kind of a attempt to try to offer the growth of the seeds into the nature, and in a sense to try to encourage nature to produce for them for the growth season, as it is indeed the case in many other agricultural societies, whereby humans make offerings to the nature or to gods of nature in order to encourage a fertile season ahead of them. So that was presumably the main reason for the use of the 7 sabze that eventually became haftzin in the Iranian tradition. There were other items as well, but some of the items that today we have on the, apparently on the haftzin are total inventions of the later times, including sumaq and sir and senjed and all the other items that to me does not seem at all kind of a, if you like, festive. And probably at some stage there should be a revision on the items of the haftzin on the Nowruz table. But this is too sacred for Iranians that I would suggest anything such as that.
Fantastic. That is a great question to end on. Thank you all for coming to this Spotlighting an Author event. We will update you on when Persian historiography and Iranian identity, or Tarikh Negari va Hoviyat Irani, is published. It will be published by Oshkar Publishers. And if you found today's event interesting, please stay tuned for upcoming Spotlighting an Author events, such as next Friday on the 18th with Claudia Yaqubi, and she'll be discussing her book, Temporary Marriage in Iran, Gender and Body Politics in Modern Iranian Film and Literature. Also, if you would like to learn more about the project, please check us out at iran1400.org. There you can find content both in English and in Farsi in the form of articles, videos, podcasts, and events about ideas and institutions, including but not limited to modernity, identity, education, and the women's movement in Iran. If you scroll to the bottom of our website, you can sign up for our email list. And with that, we'll keep you in touch about all the events that we have, as well as the new articles and videos that we'll publish. And you can also find us at Iran 1400 Project on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And lastly, thank you again, Dr. Amanat, for this wonderful and fascinating presentation. We really appreciate you giving us so much of your time today. It was incredible. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the occasion. I appreciate all the time and the effort that put into advertising this event, announcing this event. And I hope that when it appears in the book version, which is much longer, by the way, then there would be much more details that might interest some of your audience to look at it. Also, I would appreciate if you keep the questions and exchanges. I see quite a lot of them here for me in order to be able to entertain and possibly answer some of them. Thank you so much for the occasion.
Thank you, Dr. Amanat. Have a good day.
Bye.